So today we are going to start our logic and reasoning chapter, starting with logic and conditional statements. So here we go. All right, a conditional statement is an if-then. It's a statement that can be written in the form of if-then. So in other words, it would be if P, then the little arrow indicates then. Okay, so if P, then Q. So if P, then Q. The first part, the if part, not if, but the part that comes after the word if, that's your hypothesis. The part that comes after then, your Q, that is your conclusion. Okay? So what we're going to do is in this next section right here, we're going to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion of each one of these if-then conditional statements. Okay? So starting with the first one. If the moon is full, then vampires are prowling. So since if is at the beginning, then we're going to say the moon, if the moon is full. It should say is full, not is. That should say is full. There's a typo. No, I didn't catch that. So if the moon is full, so we're going to underline the hypothesis. So if the moon is full, then vampires are prowling. And we're going to circle the conclusion. The conclusion is the part that comes after then. So if and then are not part of the hypothesis and conclusion. They just tell you where they're at. Okay, so let's try the next one. If an angle is a right angle, then it measures exactly 90. So if an angle is a right angle, then it measures exactly 90. So I'm going to go, it measures exactly, and then we finish over here 90. Okay, so that's how we do it. Now, sometimes we're conditionals, they don't have to be in the form of if-then, but they can be converted. So what we're going to do is we're going to write each one of these statements. We're going to make them say if-then. Then we're going to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, so here we have free phone with every service agreement. So we could say if, let's make it a little bit bigger where we can see it. So we could say if you sign a service agreement, then you will receive a free phone. So now it is in the form of if then, and I'll make this a little smaller so it all fits on one line. So if you sign a service agreement, then you will receive a free phone. Now, they didn't say that you had to sign or receive in this free phone with service agreement, but we know this is what they mean. If you sign a service agreement, then you will receive a free phone. Okay, well, what about the next one? Okay, what if we go here? Okay, so now get $1,000 cash back when you buy a car. So how could we state that one? So let's go back. So we could say, if you buy a car, then you will get a $1,000 cash back. All right, so now let's look at the last one. An angle that is greater than 90 is an obtuse angle. So how could we word that one? So going back to here, so we could say if an angle is greater than 90 degrees, then it is an obtuse angle. So now we have written each one of these statements that they've given us. They were conditionals, even though they didn't look like it. We've written them in if-then form, so now we can identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. So let's go through and let's identify the hypothesis by underlining the hypothesis. So we're going to underline the hypothesis. So if you sign a service agreement, if you buy a car, if an angle is greater than 90 degrees, and then we're going to circle our hypothesis, then you will receive a free phone. Then you will get $1,000 cash back. Then it is an obtuse angle. Okay, does that make sense? All right, now let's talk about what happens when we negate things. Okay, think about what negate means. If P is your statement, then squiggly P is a negation of the statement. So the little squiggly is for negation. Negation means opposite. Okay, so if P, okay, so the P portion of, think about P, then Q. So now we're talking about not P. So the P portion of your statement, an angle is a right angle. Well, the negation would be an angle is not a right angle. Okay. What about it's raining? What would the negation be? It is not raining. So by using the word not, that kind of gives you your negation. Okay, what if it's not wet? It's not wet, or it is wet, because the opposite of not is is. All right, let's look at the next part. All right, so now we have what's called related conditionals. You have your conditional statement. Then there's the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. So you want to make sure that you remember them in this order because that's the order they're written. So your conditional is where you start. That's your P, then Q. The converse is like we've talked about in the past already. I just didn't call it. It's the reverse. You say it backwards. If Q, then P. The inverse is saying your first statement by negating both sides. If not P, then not Q. And the contrapositive negates your converse. If not Q, then not P. So if our statement is, if it is raining, then it is wet. Well, then the converse would be, if it is wet, then it is raining, because you just say this backwards. The inverse, which is this first one, with not, then we would say, if it is not raining, then it is not wet. And then the contrapositive is saying this one with nots. If it is not wet, then it is not raining. All right, so now notice we have a truth value. Okay, well, when you read these statements, you have to determine, is that true or false? So if it is raining, is it wet? Why, yes, it is. That would be true. Well, what about if it is wet? Then it is raining. Well, not necessarily, so that would be false. Now, what about if it is not raining? Then it is not wet. That would be false. And then we would say, if it is not wet, then it is not raining. That is true. Okay, because if it's not wet, it's not raining. If it's not raining, then it's not wet. So you kind of got to think about when you say them, would they be true or false? So what we look at is things being logically equivalent. That means they have the same truth value. For example, which statements in the chart are logically equivalent? Well, we look at the fact that the conditional and the contrapositive are both true. So we'll, if P, then Q. If not Q, then not P. And then we look at the two middle terms, which are converse and inverse. This works every time. So if your first one is true, the last one has to be true also. So make sure when you're writing it that it makes sense. And these two will always be the same. If your first is false, then the last will be false. And the middle will be the same also. Now they can all be true. Sometimes they can all be false. So these over here, The truth values don't always have to be true, false, false, true. It's just the first and the last have to be the same, and the middle two have to be the same. So if there is a false statement, so for example, here we said that if it is wet, then it is raining. If it is not raining, then it is not wet. Well, since those are both false, then you want to give a counterexample to show why it's false. So if it is wet, then it is raining. If we're going to give a counter, okay, since this statement is false, then our counter would be, well, it's wet because there's a sprinkler. So just because it's wet doesn't mean it's raining. There could be another reason it's wet. What could be another example that you can think of? I'll ask you in class. And then the next thing, make sure you come to class prepared. Write your own conditionals, your own converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So come up with an if-then statement, write it in reverse, write it with squigglies, write it backwards with squigglies. So I'm going to call on you and I'm going to ask you to read your conditional statements. And I will see you guys next time.